Hey, Push Peeps and Mr. Adrania, this is Chapter 17, Industrial Supremacy.
To start off, we have new techniques of steel production beginning in the late 19th century, including the Bessemer process, which strengthens steel. This process wouldn't have been possible had it not been for Robert Mushet's discovery that iron could be mixed with other ingredients to form steel. Later, Hewitt created a new process that ultimately replaced Bessemer's. Steel began to be used in modes of transportation and taller buildings, and was most popular in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, since large deposits of hard coal could be there, which made Pittsburgh the prominent place for steel production.
The petroleum industry was formed in the late 19th century, and that was due to the need to grease the machines. George Bissell demonstrated new ways to use oil in everyday life, and this was such as burning lamps and other stuff that you could use oil with. And in 1859, Edwin L. Drake developed the first oil well near Titusville.
The creation of gasoline led to the development of cars, which in the mid-1860s took off as a result of Nicholas August Otto's when he developed a gas-powered engine. However, this engine was not portable and couldn't be used in cars, so it was not as useful. Gottfried Daimler later elaborated on this engine and made it portable and usable in cars. The American automobile industry developed due to this invention. Charles and Frank Duryea made the first gasoline-powered car in 1893, which marked a great turning point. In 1896, Henry Ford produced the first Model T Ford, which was the first modern car. By 1917, the automobile industry was in full force.
Wilbur and Orville Wright constructed a glider that could be propelled with an internal combustion engine, and the first test flight was 4 years after the development of their glider in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So by 1904, they had improved the glider, but it was still very unsuccessful. Most of the aviation technology took place in France. However, in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh made a breakthrough when he flew from New York to Paris, which then increased America's desire to fly.
Okay, and after this, General Electric, GE, as you may know, created the first corporate laboratory in 1900, and by 1913, they were spending thousands of dollars on research. And this type of research led to a decline in government research and allowed them to apply their general knowledge to things. And in the early 20th century, university-based research and the industrial economy were intertwined with each other.
This new development of research, Taylorism, took place, which was many industrialists turning to new principles of scientific management to be a basis for more things, which sped up production by subdividing the work tasks, and it eliminated the dependence on skilled workers and increased the production rate. Due to the creation of Taylorism, assembly lines were also introduced by Henry Ford in 1914. The moving assembly line increased wages, reduced the work hours, and sped up production. As a result of Ford's successful assembly line, this led to the inspiration for an increase of railroad expansion.
And since tracks expanded drastically in the 19th century, time zones were invented as a result of railroad stations trying to set their schedules throughout the entire country. But the federal government didn't accept this as standard until 1918.
The railroad expansion contributed to the growth of the corporation. Many people took a certain liking to corporations due to the limited liability that came along with it, meaning they were only responsible for what they put in. The first corporation included the railroad industry, but soon it ranged throughout all industries, including steel with Andrew Carnegie as its head figure. Most of the heads of these corporations either expanded using vertical or horizontal integration, or even both. The use of vertical integration was the takeover of the different businesses required as an expense to make the product. But horizontal integration was basically monopolizing the one business. Rockefeller was a prime example of the tycoon who used both forms.
On to millionaires, magnates, and tycoons. These were the quote-unquote good guys in the corporate business world. Some millionaires claimed to be a self-made man and built themselves up, but tycoons started from privileged families and they already had money to begin with. For example, Andrew Carnegie was a millionaire because he believed in working his way up to where he was. The opposite of these people were the robber barons, and they were corrupt businessmen. An example is Vanderbilt.
Speaking of Andrew Carnegie, he went from the bottom up as an immigrant from Scotland. In 1873, he opened his own steel works in Pittsburgh and dominated his branch of the industry. He vertically integrated his company by striking deals with railroads, coal miners, and ore ships. This was to be able to control the entire process of steel from the mining ore to distribution.
Rockefeller was considered to be a robber baron of his time. He expanded his Standard Oil Company both through vertical and horizontal integration. He bought out most of the oil companies and then began to build terminal houses, barrel factories, and pipelines. By the 1880s, he dominated 90% of the petroleum industry and became the leading symbol of a monopoly.
Stockholders in corporations gave their stocks to a group of trustees which would give them shares in the trust itself. The stockholders had no direct control of the decisions over the stocks, however. Rockefeller created the first holding company, which was a corporate body buying up the stock from stockholders in the trust, which established a direct control over the decisions.
As a result of the growth of the trust and holding companies, along with corporations, the myth of the self-made man took foot. It was used as a way to pacify the growing concerns of capitalism that most workers had, but most of the millionaires were in fact not self-made, which meant that they built their fortune not from the ground up, although some like Andrew Carnegie were. The majority were not.
Does anyone know that y'all are in here?
Social Darwinism became a popular theory due to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. It stated that only the fittest individuals survived due to their hard work and determination. This also came as a result to pacify growing concerns of capitalism.
A popular controversy during this time was capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism, of course, was the theory that whoever worked for their money would be the most successful, and this was favored mostly by millionaires, and businesses were owned by private small business owners rather than by federal government. And then socialism was the equal distribution of wealth, and of course this was favored by farmers and workers because they didn't make as much money.
In order to make social Darwinism more appealing to the masses, Andrew Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth in 1901. It stated that millionaires had a moral responsibility to use their riches in order to advance technology and industry. Russell Conwell promoted this theory through his speech, Acres of Diamonds, and stated that most millionaires had earned their money themselves, again emphasizing the myth of the self-made man. He backed up his theory with the success story of Horatio Alger, a shunned minister, who then became a popular novelist. Thus, the American dream began.
A major issue for this time was monopolies, and many people blame monopolies for creating extremely high prices and producing an unstable economy by not having a good system. And with the lack of competition, others argued monopolistic industries could charge whatever prices they wanted, and that was really unfair. Many Americans considered monopolies dangerous because it threatened the abilities of individuals to advance in the world, especially people who didn't have as much money, who wanted to build themselves up.
Labor shortages required an influx of rural Americans to join factory life and also a great wave of immigration to occur from Latin America and other European countries. Industrial employers actively recruited these immigrant workers underneath the labor contract law until its repeal in 1885. The law permitted these employers to pay for the workers' passage to America and then deduct the amount later from their wages. Most of these immigrants were poor without job security and coming to America for opportunities. This led to another outbreak of nativism.
Since there was a large influx of immigrants, workers were paid very little and also had very little job security. As time went by, conditions sometimes grew worse, including when the power became centralized in the hands of managers to increase production. Conditions and wages were even worse for women and children. Since most women were either immigrants themselves or daughters of immigrants, it was easy for employers to take advantage of their naivety and pay them overwhelmingly low wages. For children, it wasn't much better. And even though limiting child labor laws were put in place in the 19th century, they were very ineffective.
In order to fight back against the employers, workers formed labor unions, which became lawful in Commonwealth versus Hunt in 1842. The first attempt was the National Labor Union, created in 1866, by William H. Sylvis, but quickly disintegrated after the Panic of 1873. Once the panic struck and wages decreased while unemployment rose, the Molly Maguires formed an attempt to intimidate the employers through violence and even murder. This new violent way became more accepted, and during the national strike of 1877, after a railroad wage cut 10%, riots occurred and did not stop until state militias were called in to put down the strike. The first truly national labor union that included women and other people was the Knights of Labor, which was started in 1869. by Uriah Stevens. They fought for an 8-hour workday and no child labor, but the movement disappeared during the 1890s.
Before the Knights disappeared, the American Federation of Labor formed in 1881, which represented more skilled workers and artisans. Some of their values were hypocritical, but they mainly wanted to increase the workers' position in the capitalist economy and acquire an 8-hour workday. In 1886, they staged a nationwide strike since their demands hadn't yet been met, and the movement quickly took a downturn. In Chicago, at the Haymarket Square, many people were killed by police officers and by anarchists, but only the strikers were charged. Another strike occurred at the Homestead plant near Pittsburgh since the wages were repeatedly cut. Like many others, the strike turned violent and still ended in favor of the employers. The Pullman strike in 1894 occurred as a result of 25% wage cuts. Union workers convinced Eugene Debs to shut down railroad distribution of the Pullman cars. State governors wanted the Illinois State Militia to stop the strike, but the governor refused, and then the federal government sent in troops. Shortly after, the strike collapsed, but as time passed, labor unions received many accomplishments, although none were enforced.